Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're tackling the death of Alexander the Great.
Oh, a classic.
Yeah, and it's one that's got a lot of mystery surrounding it.
A lot of mystery, a lot of different viewpoints and theories and possible causes of death.
Yeah, and so we've got a lot of sources this time.
We do.
We've got historical accounts, we've got encyclopedia entries, we've got even a YouTube documentary from Kings and Generals.
Absolutely.
So we're going to be diving into all those, trying to get to the bottom of this.
The big question being, how does someone so powerful die so young?
Right. Alexander the Great conquers most of the known world. He's only 32 when he dies in Babylon.
Babylon.
Yeah. So that's where we're starting our story in 323 BC with Alexander's arrival in this ancient city, and it's a city steeped in prophecy and omens.
Yes. Not exactly a relaxing vacation spot.
No, you would think maybe he would have taken a break after conquering, Persia and everything, but no, he goes to Babylon.
He does. And this is where things get interesting. The Chaldeans, the astrologers and priests of Babylon, they warned Alexander against entering the city.
Really?
Yes. They believed that their god, Bel, had prophesied doom if he set foot inside.
You've got to wonder, what was going through Alexander's mind when he heard that? Was he like, whatever, I'm Alexander the Great? Or was he a little bit spooked?
Yeah, I mean, he clearly wasn't deterred because he did enter the city, but they did offer him a potential workaround.
Oh, what was that?
They suggested that he enter through the royal gate facing east to maybe avert the curse.
Ah, so a little loophole in the prophecy.
Potentially.
I guess the universe is all about technicalities.
But unfortunately, the terrain around that gate was swampy and difficult, so Alexander decided to risk it and entered through another gate.
So much for avoiding fate. And this is where we get to an interesting tidbit from historian Jonah Lendering. He suggests that the Babylonians were so desperate to avoid this prophecy that they may have even tried to find a substitute for Alexander. A substitute.
Yes, someone to temporarily sit on the throne and hopefully absorb the bad omens.
The decoy king.
Exactly.
That's fascinating. It really highlights the power of superstition, even for a man like Alexander who considered himself a demigod.
It does, and, this sense of impending doom, it kind of hangs over the whole story of Alexander's death. And then there's the story of Calanus.
Oh, right, the Indian sage who was traveling with Alexander's army.
That's him. He was facing a debilitating illness and decided to end his life through self-immolation.
Yeah, that's a pretty dramatic exit.
It is. But what's even more chilling are his last words to Alexander.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about this.
He said, "We shall meet in Babylon."
Talk about foreshadowing. And what happens? Alexander dies in Babylon shortly after.
It certainly adds to the mystery and intrigue surrounding his death.
Yeah, okay, so we've got this ominous backdrop, right? But let's get into the actual accounts of his final days.
Right. So there are two main narratives that have emerged over the centuries. The first is based on the royal diaries, those detailed day-by-day accounts kept by Alexander's companions.
Ah, so we're talking first-hand accounts here.
Yes, historians like Arrian and Plutarch, they use these diaries as their main source, so this version feels like the more official account.
Right, so what did these diaries tell us?
Well, according to this version, Alexander attends this lavish feast hosted by his friend Medius.
I guess conquering an empire works up an appetite.
Of course, and perhaps a bit too much celebrating takes place because shortly after the feast, Alexander is struck by a fever.
So a classic case of overindulgence, maybe one too many goblets of wine.
Possibly?
But this is Alexander the Great. He doesn't let a little fever slow him down.
No, he tries to fight it off. He takes baths, he rests, he even continues to issue commands. This guy was dedicated to his work even on his deathbed.
Right, he's not calling in sick?
No, but sadly the fever just takes over.
It's a slow and agonizing decline.
Yeah. Eventually he loses the ability to speak. His soldiers are desperate to see him one last time.
I can imagine.
And in this really poignant scene, Alexander manages to weakly raise his hand as they file past.
Oh, wow. That's tragic and dramatic for sure. But I thought the royal diaries leaned towards poisoning.
Well, they do acknowledge the rumors of poisoning that were circulating at the time.
Yeah, there were always whispers about foul play, weren't there?
Always.
But ultimately, the royal diaries present his death as natural.
Yeah, it's like they're saying, hey, the guy pushed himself to the limit for years conquering and carousing. Something had to give eventually.
Right, it's like the burnout of ancient kings.
Exactly. But then we have the second narrative, the one that really leans into the conspiracy theories.
Oh, this is where things get juicy, isn't it?
Yeah, we call this the pamphlet version. And it pops up in sources like the Alexander Romance and that Kings and Generals YouTube documentary.
Yeah, I've seen that one. So what's the pamphlet version all about?
It's like a political thriller. It starts with Antipater Alexander's regent back in Macedon. He's starting to fear for his life.
Why? What's going on?
Well, he's hearing whispers that Alexander is suspicious of him, maybe even plotting to remove him from power.
Oh, so Antipater's feeling the heat.
Yeah, so naturally he decides to take matters into his own hands.
I can see where this is going.
Allegedly, he enlists his son Cassander to smuggle poison to Babylon.
And who's the unlucky delivery guy?
None other than Alexander's own cupbearer Iollas, who just happens to be Cassander's brother.
It's a family affair. Talk about a tangled web of betrayal.
The pamphlet even names names, telling us who was in on the plot and who was sipping wine completely unaware of the impending drama.
So what happens when Alexander drinks the poison? Does he just keel over?
Not exactly. The pamphlet describes a pretty gruesome scene. Alexander cries out in pain. He experiences excruciating stomach cramps, spasms. He even tries to induce vomiting with a poisoned feather.
Oh, wow. A poisoned feather. That's a new one.
It's pretty intense.
And that didn't help, I'm guessing.
Of course not. It only made things worse.
You've got to wonder, did nobody notice that something was seriously wrong?
Well, according to the pamphlet, Alexander in his final hours manages to dictate his entire will.
He does, so he names his successors.
He does. He gives instructions about his body and even orders the rebuilding of Thebes, a city he had previously destroyed.
Wow. Even on his deathbed, he's still making major decisions.
But this is where things get a little murky. The details of the will and the pamphlet are full of inconsistencies and contradictions.
What do you mean?
Well, it suggests that there might have been some later revisions and likely some political manipulation.
Right. Someone was definitely trying to use Alexander's death to their advantage.
Absolutely. So we have these two wildly different stories about the same event. Both agree on the date of death, June 11, 323 BC.
Right. But they offer completely different explanations for how it happened.
One suggests a natural end to a glorious, if tragically short life. The other paints a picture of betrayal and a calculated power grab.
It's enough to make you wonder, is there any truth to either of these versions, or is the real story lost somewhere in between?
And that's just the beginning. Because when we start digging into the medical evidence, things get even more complicated.
Oh, I bet. This is already a tangled web.
We'll get ready to untangle some more, because next we're diving into the possible causes of death. And let me tell you, there are a lot of theories out there.
Okay, I'm ready. Bring on the medical mysteries.
Okay, we've got typhoid fever, malaria, poisoning, even a rare neurological disorder that could have mimicked death.
You're kidding? All right, listeners, buckle up because this deep dive is about to get even more intriguing.
So we've got these two main narratives about Alexander's death.
Right. The royal diaries pointing towards natural causes, and then that pamphlet version with all the intrigue and poison.
Exactly, and both are fascinating in their own right.
Yeah, but where do we go from there? How do we sort through the fact and fiction?
Well, that's where the medical evidence comes in, or at least attempts to.
Okay, so let's play detective here.
All right, so one peculiar detail that has puzzled historians for centuries is this.
Oh, I know this one. It's the whole 6 days of no decomposition thing, right?
You got it. Some accounts claim that Alexander's body didn't show any signs of decomposition for a full 6 days after his reported death.
It's like something out of a myth or legend almost.
It's definitely strange, but modern medicine actually offers a possible explanation.
Oh, do tell.
It's called pseudothanatos.
Pseudothanatos.
Yeah, and Dr. Catherine Hall, a researcher from the University of Otago, believes this might have been the case with Alexander.
So are you saying that they might have misdiagnosed him as dead when he was actually still alive?
It's a possibility.
That's a bit unsettling.
It is. Dr. Hall suggests that Alexander might have had a rare neurological disorder called Guillain-Barré Syndrome, or GBS.
GBS.
Yeah, and it can cause paralysis so severe that it mimics the appearance of death.
Hold on, so you're saying he could have been paralyzed but still conscious?
Potentially.
That raises so many disturbing questions.
Absolutely. And what's even more interesting is that some of the symptoms described in the accounts, like the ascending paralysis and his mental clarity, almost until the very end, do align with GBS.
So maybe it wasn't poison after all, but this medical mystery.
It's a compelling theory.
But I'm guessing GBS doesn't explain everything.
Not quite. Remember those accounts from the royal diaries that mention fever, chills, exhaustion in the days leading up to his death?
Yeah, that sounds like a classic case of some kind of infection.
Exactly. And there's a report from the University of Maryland School of Medicine that suggests typhoid fever as a possible cause.
Typhoid.
Well, their report highlights how Alexander's symptoms, high fever, chills, abdominal pain, all match up with what we know about typhoid fever.
That makes sense considering the conditions he was traveling and campaigning in. Sanitation wasn't exactly a top priority back then.
Right. But then we also have another historian, Andrew Chugg, who argues that it could have been malaria.
Malaria.
Yeah, he's the one who analyzed the ephemerides.
The what now?
The ephemerides. Those were journals kept by Alexander's secretary Eumenes,
Okay.
and they provide a more detailed record of his day-to-day activities.
So like the ancient equivalent of a daily planner?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Meetings, travels, notable events like illnesses, they're all recorded in the ephemerides.
Wow, that's a pretty meticulous record keeping.
And Chugg argues that the fever patterns described in the ephemerides specifically, that it was initially intermittent, point towards malaria.
Interesting. And considering Alexander was traveling through swampy areas where malaria was rampant.
It's definitely a plausible theory.
So we've got typhoid, we've got malaria, but I feel like we're forgetting something.
The elephant in the room?
Poison.
Ah, yes, the poisoning theory.
That one just won't go away, will it?
Well, it's hard to ignore, especially with the pamphlet version pushing that narrative so strongly.
But is there any actual evidence to support it?
Some historians have proposed that arsenic was the poison used.
Arsenic. Classic.
But Dr. Leo Shep, a toxicologist, has proposed a different culprit.
Oh, I'm intrigued.
He believes it could have been veratrum album, also known as white hellebore.
White hellebore. Doesn't sound like something I'd want in my tea.
It's actually a highly toxic plant, and what's interesting is that another ancient historian, Diodorus, mentions Alexander experiencing excruciating pain after drinking wine. Yeah, Dr. Shep believes that the wine could have been laced with white hellebore.
So instead of a quick and silent death, it would have been slow and agonizing.
Exactly.
And we've only just scratched the surface here.
There's West Nile virus pancreatitis, acute endocarditis, which is a serious heart infection.
Wow. It just keeps going.
Some experts have even suggested that Alexander's congenital scoliosis might have played a role.
Scoliosis.
Yeah, they believe it could have been part of a larger syndrome that led to complications and eventually his death.
It's almost overwhelming, isn't it? So many possibilities, but no clear answers.
It's true, and it makes you wonder, why is it so difficult to pinpoint exactly what happened to one of history's most famous figures?
I mean, we're talking about Alexander the Great here. You'd think we'd have a pretty good grasp of how he died.
Well, we have to remember that we're dealing with ancient texts written decades, even centuries after the events.
Right, so there's bound to be some bias and embellishment.
Exactly, and we don't have access to Alexander's body for modern forensic analysis.
Oh, right. The location of his tomb has been lost for centuries.
So while we have a wealth of intriguing clues, we're missing that definitive piece of the puzzle.
The smoking gun.
Exactly. What we do know for certain is that Alexander's death was sudden, unexpected, and it had a seismic impact on the course of history.
Absolutely. And speaking of impact, let's not forget about what happened to Alexander's body after his death.
Right. That's a whole other saga.
Yeah, it's not over yet, folks. Alexander's story continues even after he's gone.
Stay tuned as we delve into the strange afterlife of Alexander the Great's body.
Okay, so Alexander's dead, but the story doesn't end there.
No, not at all. In fact, you could say things get even more interesting.
Oh. How so?
Well, there's the whole matter of what happened to his body.
Right, because the initial plan was to transport his body back to Macedon, his homeland, right?
That's right. They even built this extravagant funeral cart fit for a king.
I can only imagine.
Oh, it was supposed to be this grand spectacle. But of course, things didn't exactly go according to plan.
Of course not. There were always power struggles going on, weren't there?
Always. And in this case, it was Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, who had set his sights on Egypt, who decided to, well, hijack the funeral procession.
She did what?
Yeah, he diverted the body to Memphis.
Wow, talk about a power move, but why Memphis?
It was strategic. By controlling Alexander's body, Ptolemy was essentially asserting his legitimacy.
Right, it's like he's saying, hey, I've got the great Alexander here with me, so I'm the one you should follow.
Exactly. It was a way to gain political leverage.
Clever, but also a little bit morbid.
Well, that's politics for you.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the logistics for a moment. Preserving a body on a long journey, especially back then, couldn't have been easy.
Yeah, that's a good point. What did they do?
Well, some accounts mention the use of honey.
Honey? Really?
Yeah, sounds a bit messy, doesn't it? But Plutarch mentions that Egyptian embalmers were brought in to handle the process.
That makes more sense. The Egyptians were the masters of mummification.
Exactly. And there's this intriguing detail that even after all this time and travel, Alexander's body reportedly still looked remarkably lifelike.
Really? Like he was just sleeping. That's both fascinating and a little creepy.
It is. Some historians connect it to the ascending paralysis we talked about earlier.
Right, the potential symptom of typhoid fever.
Yeah. It basically means the paralysis moves up the body and can create the illusion of death when there might still be some brain activity.
So they might not have even been entirely sure if he was truly gone when they started the embalming process.
It's a possibility, and it adds another layer to the mystery.
Okay, so back to the journey. So Ptolemy takes the body to Memphis, but then what?
Well, after a while, he decides to transfer it to Alexandria, that magnificent city Alexander was building on the Egyptian coast.
Ah, so Alexander finally reaches his namesake city, even if it's not quite the way he intended.
Right. But he doesn't immediately get a proper burial. He's placed in a communal mausoleum, a sort of VIP graveyard for important figures.
So even in death, he's surrounded by the elite.
And get this. The Roman Emperor Augustus later visited the mausoleum and paid his respects to Alexander by placing flowers and a diadem on his body.
Wow, what a moment in history.
Right?
But you said he didn't get a proper burial right away. What happened?
Well, that's where the trail goes cold. By the 4th century AD, the location of Alexander's tomb is a complete mystery.
A mystery, but people must have looked for it, right?
Oh, they did. Several authors throughout history have claimed to have seen it, but its exact whereabouts are unknown to this day.
It's like the ultimate historical cliffhanger.
It is. This king who conquered most of the known world dies under mysterious circumstances, and then even his final resting place vanishes without a trace.
It's a reminder that even with all our technology and research, some mysteries just stay buried in the past.
Exactly. We're left with these tantalizing clues, these conflicting accounts, but no definitive answers.
So after all this, do we know anything for certain about Alexander's death?
Well, we know that it was sudden and unexpected, and that it had a seismic impact on the world.
Right. His empire was thrown into chaos. His generals fought amongst themselves for power. His family was wiped out.
And it makes you wonder, what if he had lived longer? What if he had died of old age? Would his empire have held together? Would he have continued conquering?
It's a question that's been debated for centuries.
And it's one that we'll never truly know the answer to.
I guess that's part of what makes history so fascinating, isn't it? The mysteries, the what-ifs. It keeps us curious, keeps us wanting to learn more.
It does. And it reminds us that history isn't just about the past. It's also about the questions we ask about it, the stories we tell, and the ways we try to make sense of the events that shaped our world.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the mysterious death of Alexander the Great. Thanks for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of history's greatest mysteries.